So this is our last panel, and this is a very carefully constructed panel because the issue is a very big picture issue, right? And what we wanted to do was to have a panel of people who are not the same, right? Who really look at the world from a different point of view. And I'm very pleased the one we have. The people who've already been introduced, I won't introduce this the second time, but like Doug, Evan Lowe is the CEO of Paratek Pharmaceuticals. He has been the CEO since 2019, and before that, he was president, chief operating officer, and chief medical officer. He has a long career in the pharmaceutical industry, first as a medical doctor and as a professor at Harvard Medical School, but then he had a very successful career at Pfizer and in a lot of senior development roles. And he's been a friend for many, many years, and which is my great pleasure and honor. Lisa Henderson, I've known also for many, many years, and she is the group editorial director for Pharmaceutical Executive Magazine, Applied Clinical Trials, and Pharmaceutical Commerce. Now, Lisa, I do hope that they're paying you 3 salaries. Yes, I forgot to know you were editor-in-chief of Pharmaceutical Executive, and now you're group editorial director for 3 magazines. So I'm sure, you're having fun spending all 3 salaries.
Oh, my.
No, but what's interesting is because each of those has a different emphasis. So one is clinical trials, one has to do with pharmaceutical commerce, supply chain, etc. And pharmaceutical executive is all the regulatory, marketing, sales oriented issues for the C-suite. So she has many hats, but also it's very helpful for the topic that we're going to talk about. So I have a kind of a list of questions that I'm going to go through, and for us all, the rule is each panelist is not required to say anything, but if they have a comment or thought about a particular question, that would be appreciated. But I'm going to start out with an obligatory, question, which each panelist just take 2 or 3 minutes to say, beyond the title of what you're doing, what are you doing? What do you do? Of your current responsibility at your job today? What are you doing? And we'll just arbitrarily start with you, Lisa. So, in your job as group executive director, what do you do? Right?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. So I spend a lot of time going to conferences, speaking to people. Clearly, that wasn't a thing during COVID, but there were a lot of virtual, opportunities, and in all different. It's a horizontal of the drug development chain. So I just spent a lot of time speaking with people, speaking with vendors. Obviously, we're a B2B, so we're supported by vendor advertising, and then we reach the decision makers that they want to reach. And I guide the content. So I just try and make sure that with my editorial advisory board, I just try and make sure that the readers and the audience have the content that they need to do their job better.
Doug, other than the fact that you keep the airline business industry profitable, what else do you do?
No, I got 4.2 million on Unite.
So wow. That's the president.
Million on American.
Oh,
250 on Delta. And my wife was a Pan Am flight attendant back in the day, so when first class was first class, and they served you a great bottle of champagne when you came on the plane, caviar, and they cut the tenderloin as they went down the aisle. So if you wanted medium rare, did that. It's a little different.
it's a little bit different.
And if you're lucky. I've to do that many miles, it means I've been a lot of places. China many times, Japan many times, Australia many times, South America. So I generally do 80 to 100 presentations a year to wholesalers, pharmacy chains, PBMs, generic companies, biotech companies, you name it. So with that, I've met a number of people along the way, and you can see them, on their way up, when they, then they become CEO of the company. And then one of my latest friends got forced out as CEO of the company. So it's been an interesting ride, and what's made it the best is the people.
But
From all over.
But I gather what you do is you are a very important mouthpiece for with the world, with clients and so forth.
I think so.
Yeah, that's just.
But, the American Express didn't think so today when I was trying to change my flight, and then she said, "Don't you know who I am?" It's like for $250, and I'll put it on my own personal credit card, but I want to be on a plane out of Newark, New Jersey tomorrow morning at 6.
Whenever I think about that, I think about that George Clooney movie, where the guy travels all the time and spends most of the time in airports. And when I saw that movie, I thought of you.
Yeah, but here, let me give you a response to that. George Clooney's 45 in that movie, right? To get 4 million miles, or he had 10 million miles, right? Think about that. That's if he was traveling for 20 years, that would be 500,000 miles a year for 20 years, right? Yeah. And he basically flying to China every week. First of all, no company lets you fly to China every week. They say, go for 2 weeks, come back for 2 weeks, go for 2 weeks. But there is a guy in United. If you're interested, it's going 21 million miles. He's out of New Jersey, and he doesn't stay home. I'm gonna fly to Tokyo, just for the hell of it. He may get a room that night, or he may just fly, get on the other plane and come back. I don't know why, but there's one guy, 21 million miles.
I heard he flew with the Wright brothers, right? But they didn't have a frequent flyer program at that time, right? Evan, my friend Evan, go ahead. Tell me a little. What do you do on a day-to-day basis as the CEO?
Well, worry. Worry every day, 24/7. And I think that's one thing that people don't really realize and appreciate about CEO job. You have a single product. It's existential survival every day. That being said, I think you've got to run a company, and so pretty much 3 or 4 big domains, right? One is to take care of my board, make sure I serve at the pleasure of my board. Everybody's got a boss, right? So serve at the pleasure of my board, make sure there's good communication there. No surprises there, ever. Number 2, hire a management team that can run the company. I don't run the company. I've got a deeply experienced senior management that knows what they're doing. I have tremendous trust there to build that team. The third piece is raise money. Make sure the company has money. One thing that I've learned is that when you don't have money, you can only be reactive. And when you actually have money and a strong balance sheet, you can actually be strategic. I think those are really, really important pieces. And related to that, spend a lot of time on Wall Street just to, I think as part of my company story is to build credibility each and every day. Because I do think as this particular topic is talking about, the times that we're living in today, this is where credibility matters. Because they trust you still. At what's happening in terms of the macro, which you can't control. So those are some of the things that I think about it, spend my time.
And sometimes the market is fair, sometimes it's not fair, sometimes unfair the other way, and it's really hard to say. And I run Young Partners, and I have a long career in strategy consulting, Bain, venture capital, and then investment banking, where I run very senior groups at Lehman Brothers and Salomon Brothers before. A group of us started Young Partners, and I feel a little bit like the CEO because the part of my job is running the firm, and a large part is working with clients on their problems and so forth, which was why I got into the business to begin with, which is a source of great joy. But I will tell you, the regulatory, like your regulatory thing, investment banks have their regulatory, and it's not fun, dealing with FINRA and all these things. I got to tell you, you have to go through things that you wouldn't believe. Like, we have no customer accounts, but there's a whole set of regulations about anti-money laundering. We cannot launder money because we don't have any customer accounts. So we have to have anti-money laundering training and all these other and procedures, so forth. And I asked the regulator, I said, why do we have this? He said, well, because we think everyone should follow every rule. So that was the answer. So let's start out. The reason for this panel was actually because there've been so many disruptions. And I'm just going to list some of them. And what I'd like is really this panel really to reflect on the ones that seem to be the most prominent that you're dealing with, either yourself or your clients or your readers. And let me just give you, this is not a complete list, right? But I'll just list some. Pandemic, legislative action, the stock market change, rising interest rates, potential recession, global geopolitical tensions, like we were talking about before, about US, China, Ukraine, supply chain problems, tariffs and restrictions on investment cross borders, such as CFIUS, right, which they actually increased the rule, made their rules stricter more recently. Funding, NIH and other research organizations, changes in relevant policies and practices. And that's just a short list. I mean, the list is much longer. So each of you has a different point of view of the world from where you stand. I'd like you to comment, say, what are the ones that seem to be the ones that you have to deal with the most, either yourself or, if your clients have to deal with. And no particular order, whoever wants to speak first.
I'll start. So, in our November issue of Applied Clinical Trials, we have an article about, what G1 Therapeutics had to do in the Ukraine to get some of their oncology patients in their clinical trial. If they wanted to stay, were they able to stay? Did they want to leave? There was a lot of things going down on the ground. So they were able to move with a couple of their CROs. I think 8 of the patients, they moved out. They got them treatment somewhere else. They started their trials there. And of course, they had to navigate the actual logistics of moving the patients, their caregivers, their drug supply, the regulations around that. But they did that, and they also, it wasn't a large, I think it was 8 or 10 patients. It wasn't a large amount, but they were very aware of it and very stressed, that they wanted to do that for them. And also, their CRAs and the sites on the ground, some of them couldn't communicate. They were in, I don't know if they were in like bomb shelter. I'm not sure how, but they were in places where they couldn't communicate. So, so that was a problem for them, but they recognized it. So we asked, well, number one, would you have gone and done the trial in the Ukraine? And they said, yes, of course. Ukraine is one of the greatest places prior to do a clinical trial. And, we heard there was some problems, but it didn't seem it was going to go that way. So much like COVID, what, we're learning is you have to build a lot of risk mitigation into your trial program. And that probably is more costly, I guess, because you have to plan and make sure that those plans are all viable, and you have to research it. But that's one.
I would, I'm going to defer to you on all the economic stuff.
Okay.
Since you're the expert, right? On the Ukraine part, is that all these refugees went across the border, and the initial concern was get rid of COVID with, and that didn't happen. The other thing that interests me is I remember, this is why I did appreciate Dr. Marks a lot, but that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they have to say. And I would say to him is that, if he's looking why people are vaccine skeptic, he should talk to Dr. Kachi on that, in his own house. I have a great love for Africa. My wife and I've been there on safari five times. We're just there in August, and used to be, that all the experts said that Africa would bear the brunt of COVID because it was the least vaccinated place on earth. But that wasn't the case, because what the experts didn't realize or didn't take into consideration, the average age of an African is 19 years old, and they're not likely to die of COVID. Plus, they take malaria pills, you take all this other stuff. So they were totally wrong. So, and I don't like the stifling of dissenting opinion. One of the guys that I thought, like Dr. Mark McCary from Johns Hopkins, you know, who's kind of the anti-Fauci. What are we locking down for? Why are we paying all this attention to vaccines and not for the therapeutics? What are we wearing? What are we doing hand sanitizing for? When we could have figured out that COVID doesn't spread by hand. You know, why are we doing masks? You know, all this, and his big one is why are we vaccinating these kids? Because their death rate is 0. So that's of interest to me. The other part is, which we did at the tail end, is the supply chain. There's got to be much greater visibility that companies got to have into their supply chain. And there's got to be much more redundant planning, because you just don't want to put all your eggs in one basket in this environment, nor any environment.
So are you saying that, you know, when you're talking about the Africa situation, whatever, are you saying that, you know, all these experts are analyzing things, setting policies and so forth, and deciding where vaccines should be going, so forth? Do you think the missing element is the science? Is it the judgment? I mean, that being not recognizing the age difference of the African population, you know, this is not an obscure piece of data, right?
Well, I mean, I can make a case that, we all can make a case that maybe they were right 75% of the time. They certainly weren't right 100% of the time. And I didn't like when they're shutting off dissenting opinions. If you had a dissenting opinion, you were locked out of social media. I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all, because nobody's 100% right. You want to hear both sides and figure out what the right answer might be. And then I thought what was interesting this week is last week is that a lab in Boston saw this. They developed a COVID strain that's 80% fatal to mice. And I'm wondering, why are we doing that?
Yeah, right.
You know,
Yeah, and then he set up on that were the most similar to mice. Didn't he?
Yeah, for animal models, yeah.
so I'm glad that Peter and I, you know, because I probably wouldn't be working for IQVIA anymore. I guess can't antagonize anybody, but
So I guess if that had spread, they would call it the Boston strain.
oh, but I mean, so what were they studying for, to develop a vaccine against it? I don't, you know, it's just like the Wuhan thing. Is it, and then the last part, Peter, is that you saw these countries trying to protect their own borders. You know, so you have all this free trade supposed to go on, and then when COVID hit, people started to lock down, couldn't get it from point A to point B.
Evan, your turn.
So what I'd say is, in uncertain times, my view is that in my current role, every day is an uncertain day. It's the way I live my life around my responsibilities. And I think what helped me was that I was a chairman of a company for 2.5 years when we were private, before we went public, when we had no money. I remember you and I had a lunch here in the Yale Club. We had that lunch where I was desperately asking you for advice. I'm like, how do I raise like $10?
I said slowly.
Yeah. I think there's a place where if you actually can live through something like that and understand what your base principles are, how you approach adversity, and how bad that felt, that you never will allow anything else that you run to ever be close to that. And so as I think about sort of the functioning and being successful in uncertain times, first of all, always build credibility with whoever you work with, including the people that you raise money from. That's number one. Number two, you need credibility with your board, that they ultimately absolutely trust you in your thinking, but at the same time, you're absolutely transparent with them. And finally, you want a strong balance sheet. You want a strong balance sheet to be able to weather any storm that comes your way. And what I mean by strong balance sheet is that it's not encumbered in the way that you can't raise money. And number two, that you have enough cash in your balance sheet that you can actually weather a storm. And you saw many, many stories here of people that had weak balance sheets or no cash on hand. And when things went to zero,
they had no reserves. And so for me, you know, $50 to $100 million in my bank all the time is kind of like where I'd like to live. Because today, you know, in terms of my cash out the door on a quarterly basis, it's almost $40 million. That's a quarter's worth of functioning. Everything goes to zero. If my manufacturing goes to zero, or I have a flood or a fire, and I can't actually do that. I mean, I have a year's worth of API in my current manufacturing supply chain based in Europe. Am I worried about what's going on geopolitically? Absolutely. Are my costs going up? As mentioned, they're going up come January 1st, a lot in terms of raws. Can I pass that down to my customers? No, because we're a US-based company, and guess what? Current administration has said there are going to be very, very big penalties if you go above the CPI in terms of increasing your drug product costs. But you know, that's a big issue for me.
Just go to 9.
I can't. You know, there
CPI is gonna be 9.
I know, but there are other adjustments
I know.
that come into that calculation where the penalty is much worse if you actually violate that. And I've got manufacturing costs that are currently coming in at bids, and we're going to negotiate down to increase my raws by 25% over this year's cost. Just think about that, right? And what I'm not able to do in order to actually keep my business going. So I need to have a strong balance sheet to actually get to a point where my revenues can actually then help me get on the other side of what's going on in terms of the inflationary pressures as well as the tax rates. I think that, you know, my view is that we're probably going to be in this place for at least, you know, 18 to 24 months. So I've got a 18 to 24 month period of time where I've got to figure out how to make sure that we can weather this storm, build my business, control what I can control. I can't really worry that much about the macro. And at this point in time, we're not raising money. So that's, you know, we don't have to do that. We've got a real business. We're just going to keep our heads down and continue to, you know, build credibility in terms of being able to deliver. As a biotech company, you want to be able to deliver against your milestones. Peter, you already mentioned some of our reputation in terms of our R&D milestones, but also on the commercial milestones as well. We've never missed on anything that we promised. And, you know, we're blessed by the third thing that I will say in terms of if you have a single product as a biotech company, think about how you do life cycle extension. Really, really important for getting your product looked at in a much broader way. If you can't, you can't. If you can, you know, I would definitely encourage that, because that brings up I think the general sheen and the gleam of what you have to get people to notice actually what you're able to do.
Yeah, I'm going to answer a question from the perspective of, you know, we work with so many different companies, and so I'll answer it from the point of view of what I think they have been experiencing. And a couple comments. One is each company is different in terms of where they've been hit by these uncertainties. The other is it depends on what time frame. So, for example, up and through the end of 2021, there was mainly things like operation, right? The disruptions to the clinical trials because of the pandemic, or supply chain problems, right? You know, some of the raw material issues or whatever. So those are the kinds of things, and it created a lot of uncertainty on the part of the CEOs and the senior management of the clients that we work. Regardless of size, right? I mean, it's a bigger problem for Pfizer as it is for a small biotech. It suddenly shifted starting at the beginning of this year. So because of this year, suddenly we ended up with a huge financial issue, right? Because suddenly the stock prices dropped, suddenly the availability of funding started to really dry up in certain pockets in a gradual rolling basis. So that compounded it, not for the big pharma, because the big pharma, you know, they don't have an issue about funding, you know, or in their stock. Stock prices did not get hit that much. So it really affected the small to medium sized, you know, biotechs and so forth. So they still have the same issues that related to supply chain and so forth. But then layered on top of that, they had to deal with all these cash flow and funding and shareholder liquidity issues. I'll say that for most of these CEOs, if they say, what do I do? I said, the one thing for sure is you got to be really resilient. It's a little bit like what you're saying, right? Be really resilient. don't have hard positions about certain things, and one should always do this because it's what it's. The other, though, is recognize that for many of these things, you can't forecast.
Yeah.
See, for a lot of people, they say, okay, I'll build out 2 or 3 scenarios and then I'll work my strategy around those 2 or 3 scenarios. The biggest problem many of these people have now is they don't know what scenarios to plan on, right? And if that's the case, it becomes even more important to be able to pivot and dodge and so forth and have financial reserves and beyond what you normally would have. So I would just say it's been a very stressful environment for the last couple of years. And not all of these things on the list have been affecting my clients uniformly in the same way, right? It varies. But definitely each one's had at least 2 or 3 things that affected them. And then starting from January 1, this whole financial stock market thing hit. And they're having to deal with that on top.
I mean, I mentioned one very discrete COVID macro that was really something not anticipated, right? So we launched in February of 2019, and we launched with a hospital sales force of about 40 reps. 40 reps sounds really small to someone who buys, right? But for us, that's what we could afford. That's what we put out there. And we were going to go and get into the hospital space, which is where antibiotics traditionally have to get launched first to get the imprimatur of the ID, right? So that's what we did. Did that for 11 months. And then another 2 months after that, February of 2020, everything gets shut down. Thank goodness we had actually done a little bit of work, got some formulary approvals, and actually had some relationships for hospital to be able to use and buy our product. Come March 13th of 2020, every hospital shut down. We couldn't get into it. It didn't matter even whether we were on formulary or not. Antibiotics are a promotion-sensitive business. Whether you have an oral, whether you have IV, it's a promotion-sensitive business. We had to figure out how to go virtual, how to actually take a sales force that, in fact, is hospital sales reps are what we refer to as thoroughbreds. They are high maintenance. They are high. They have high expectations, and they cost the most of any sales rep that you would buy. And we asked them to actually sit in their homes and try to make contact and make sales with docs through a computer. Didn't work very well. That all being said, I think we continue to have the ability to rely on some of those prior relationships. But there are some biotech companies that launched their products, their hospital-based products in 2020. How do you think that went? It didn't go. And subsequent to some of that, we have a couple of antibiotic-focused biotech companies that have actually declared Chapter 11 after about 20 months of launch. So some of it's timing, as you said, Peter, and some of it's just if you have the ability to weather that storm and have enough cash reserves, have a strong enough balance sheet, and you set your company up, have the ability to be flexible and think about different strategies. But the best time to do it is do it when it's not in that position. Very hard when you're stressed out and your team is just trying to survive, to try to come up with a set of strategic directions in a balanced and comforting way. Because, as you said, you take the one that's most near term that you're gonna say yes to, but you can't really feel that you can take the long view. And for us, it's always been about taking the long view and doing what's right and durable.
The best term I've heard is adaptation. You have to adapt. Whether that's business-wise, personal-wise, it's, COVID had a lot of personal issues too.
Yeah, I mean, your data says what the hospital's coming back, right? Coming back to kind of pre-COVID levels. But when's it coming back? 2 years later, right? 3 years later.
Well, they will have to
March of 2020.
You have to get the query work itself out.
Yeah, it's got to work its way through the system.
But that just shows you how important that product was at the time.
Yeah.
So, kind of cut the question along a different line. That is, I'd like each of you to name the 2 or 3 most disruptions that had the biggest impact on either your companies you work with or your own company or so forth. The 2 or 3 disruptions out of the list of 20, right, that you think had the biggest impact on the people in the industry, right? Lisa, you want to start?
Well, I'm gonna go with the effects from the pandemic. So everything went digital or decentralized. So if you're looking at clinical trials, yes, there was fallout from that. And, you know, people couldn't go into the sites, and sites that, especially academic centers, they shut down, or the hospitals, you know, they were seeing the COVID patients. So they, sponsors and or CROs that run the trials for them had to pivot and implement some decentralized strategies really quickly. And some companies saw positive effects to that. And that has continued to impact some decisions now, because some people really like the decentralized hybrid model. They put it toward a patient-centric movement, meaning your clinical trial participant can participate anywhere in the world, basically, you know, and report in their data. So that's been a lot of upheaval, I think. I mean, a lot of positive, but a lot of choices that companies have to make in their clinical trial design. And also, I'm not sure how many trials have gone through. I'm sorry, not how many of the submissions have gone through with any missing data or thing. You know, we were keep waiting for case studies to see how those types of submissions went as far as the data collection. So I have to say that piece, and the digitization on the commercial side, you know, the omni-channel rep thing, you know, the omni-channel reaching the HCP, you know, because you couldn't go into the doctor's office, you couldn't do how do you communicate, what do we do? So now they're moving the strategies, and I just think that they've become more complex too. So
Doug?
You know, mine is more, you know, I think there's, everybody adapted. I mean, things are different. They somehow got through it. Mine is more of, you walk around New York City and you see that maybe half the buildings are occupied.
Right.
And then the ancillary effects of that in terms of restaurants, bars, shops, you know, you walk down the streets, the number of shops are closed. I mean, during the pandemic, I went to Charlotte, which is the bank capital of America, and there was nobody in those buildings. This was like November of 2021, nobody. And there was, you know, you could hear a pin drop in the middle of downtown Charlotte.
If you were there.
If you were there, and I had.
If you were there, you wouldn't even hear the pin drop.
I just remember that American Airlines lost my bag. But, you know, we got so fixed on COVID. You know, it was COVID, lockdown, vaccine. And we didn't have any understanding of what the long-term effects would be, such as suicides, overdoses, mental health. Now you have test scores. Yeah. The test scores are abysmal. And, you know, I live in Florida. We got our kids back in school in August of 2020. My grandchildren didn't get back in school to May of 2021 in Seattle. Wow.
I think the 1, 2, or 3 biggest, not just for you, but for the industry, because you know a lot of people in the industry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of spaces for me. One is that I think, you know, COVID allowed people to really rethink their priorities. And they got to make some decisions around what they wanted to do. I had a departure of one of my very senior level leaders, you know, the head of my manufacturing group left about 18 months ago. And so, you know, he wanted to be in a different place, and he didn't want to be virtual, and joined a company that actually had a very different approach to being virtual or being hybrid. The other piece that I think was very interesting to me, it's good learning for me, was that, you know, we went 100% virtual in a day, and our business was okay. We kept going, and, you know, people were able to do their business. But what I've learned as a CEO is that, you know, the CEO sets the tone and drives the culture of the company. For better or for worse, that's the choice that the board made. And so, you know, we had a long time where I was CEO before then, and part of the company for almost 10 years now. And I've learned that, you know, we can get stuff done on Zoom.
But Zoom, to me, the way I think about Zoom is that it is simply a transactional medium. Think about that.
It's not a relationship.
It is transactional. It is not relational. And what you miss in building your culture are those collisions and or those moments that you have 5 or 10 minutes before a meeting and the 10 minutes after that. Think about what you miss when you're not there and leaving and just walking, just having another thought and talking to somebody going to your
Or at the water.
or at the water fountain. Those collisions don't happen. Those interactions don't happen. And so one of the things that we've been working on for the last 18 months is how do we get people back into the office? And how do we think about creating that kind of environment without creating the word mandate has become verboten in most settings. And so how do we actually ultimately do that? One of the things that I tried to test the hypothesis that if the CEO shows up in the office Monday through Friday, everyone's going to show up.
Unless they dislike you.
Well, they really did, Peter, they really dislike me because guess what? I tested that hypothesis. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. They don't care. They don't care.
They're being in on cash.
They don't care. That being said, I think we've been able to move to a place where we've actually been able to articulate to them is that to ask them the question, what can you get better done in an office setting that you can't get done at home? And what we've been able to talk about are solving problems.
Yes.
Solving difficult problems. You want to get people in a room. You want to bring them in. And so we decided that Tuesdays and Thursdays are our problem solving. And people actually come in. You know, we have about in one of our sites down near Philadelphia, we have a capacity about 80 people. On those Tuesdays and Thursdays, we might have 40 or 50 people. It's great. Which is great. The rest of the time, I'm kind of by myself. Monday and Fridays, I can have the run of the office, get whatever soda I want out of the fridge. I don't have to compete for the soda in the fridge. All this other sort of stuff. But it's one of those things where I think, as you said, we've been able to adapt. I think the workforce has different expectations. That being said, I have a business to run. And I think about running the business. I'm not apologetic for actually putting out there what I think is actually important for us to be able to derive a culture. And I think the easiest way to define a culture, all of us have been part of consultants that have come in to try to define the culture of the organization, right? And I define it very simply as how do you solve problems?
Well, it's very interesting because a lot of what you say, I can relate to in my own firm.
Because no one's coming in, right? They don't like you either.
No. Whether they like me or not, first of all, 7 or 8 years ago, we just decided that all this travel, was a huge waste of time.
Yeah.
But also we had a lot of clients who thought it was a problem because we had a client in Brazil, and if we had an in-person meeting, they had to bring people in from different parts of Brazil, which any travel in Brazil, it takes like a long time. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the only place where you can take a flight and see 2 movies and have 2 meals, and you're still in Brazil. You're still in Brazil, right? Check out and going back to New York. So we said we're going to investigate video conferencing, universal video, and we're going to keep testing until it works, and then we're going to try to get our clients to move to video conferencing, and we started that 8 years ago. And the interesting thing is we looked at every technology against a criteria, which is it universal? Does it violate firewall problems, right? Because if you're working with companies like Fire and so forth, you can't have something where they have to download software. They're just not going to do it. And we finally found one that worked 8 years ago, which was this tiny little company called Zoom. Interesting enough. So we adopted Zoom, and we basically tried to say, let's use Zoom. And it was extremely helpful because it eliminated all wasted time, but also if you want to have a meeting, you could schedule it the next day or in the afternoon rather than scheduling it in person 2 weeks later. Then the world changed, but by the time the world changed, we'd already been doing it for years. So it was not a big change for us. But the interesting about this in the office versus not, our philosophy is this. I don't believe in saying you have to do it because I told you, like the Jamie Dennis, you have to do it because I'm telling you to, right? Yeah. I prefer if they feel that they're better off. And I think the feeling is exactly what you said, which is solving complex problems is very hard to do on Zoom. because you have an iterative process. I know working with so many people, Jonathan, when we're dealing with a really, really complicated problem, we're just a lot better off if we're in the same room. We look at the screen together, so this, well, let's try that, whatever. You can't do that by a Zoom, right? But the other is the interaction, right? It's really enjoyable to work together and solve difficult problems, whatever. So although we say 3 days a week, we pick 3 days of the days that we together. But if it happens to be one of the days is not the day where everybody's in, but we have a complex problem, we'll come in anyway, right? Because we believe that's the only way to solve the problem, right? So I think it has to be driven by people feeling that or whatever policy you have, right? That they're better off.
Yes.
Right, that they're better off, or they're not gonna do it, right? As you're finding. Next question is,
Which may be complicated, because I think this is that, when I was in Milan, they had this, really hotshot consultant who was talking about quiet quitting. All this, the new generation, that the kids have been indulged in. Do you have any of that?
Yeah.
Challenge it?
Yeah, sure.
That was never an option, it's like, if I didn't work, I didn't eat. So.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah, join the club. It's one of those things where it's generational. It's absolutely, because I have a cohort of workers that are moms, and they've been having babies for the last 3 years, and that's a very different mindset than someone like me, who's my son's 30 years old, out of the house, it's just me and my wife. So the considerations are just diametrically opposed. And
so you don't have to babysit.
I'm not offering to babysit. That being said, I think we have to just figure out, I think we have to be careful though, too, to regress to a non-functional need. And I don't know where that need is for any one particular solution problem, right? I think you can't all go to that quiet quitting space, right? I mean, that's not okay either, because we have a lot of business. So you want the people there, you're hiring them for the talent. They need to know that. And we want them to come in and actually be with us to solve complex problems.
And what I'd like to do is open up to any questions from anyone, either virtual or here in person. If you have any questions, you can direct it to any of the panelists or all panelists. If it's a particularly difficult question, please ask Doug, right? Any questions, or
That's elder abuse.
or if you have a particular story you want to talk about with regard to dealing with disruptions from your own company, which we would love to hear from anyone. Does anyone either have a question or perhaps a story they want to tell?
Jonathan?
Maybe.
Okay, all right, okay, all right.
So sharing, it's very interesting, right? These are the topics which are contextual, and we're all living through the same world, right? So I think personally, I took a very opposite approach. So in June of 2021, everybody got their 2 shots. And so I felt that there was no further excuses to not coming to the office. So I was a small company, 40 people, 45 people. So I made it kind of, and it was just all over the map. And most companies would bring people in and then they put them out, and people were just kind of dancing around, like in, out, change of policies every week, starting with Jamie Dimon, and then the big banks, and now we're reading what's happening on Wall Street, that I just couldn't figure out anything. But I felt that, after people that have the 2 shots, they just made it mandatory. So completely opposite, right? And I lost 10 people within 1 month. Yeah, sort of 40, 25% left. Guess what? I found 10 other people. And very often our experiences with new people are equal or if not, maybe sometimes better, right? And after that, the company working smoothly because there was no hotspot, there was no confusion. And I felt that like outweighed the initially I was very nervous when I lost 10 people, but I got over that and we never had any questions about it. So I mean, I'm sharing that as an alternative approach to disruption, and it kind of gave some foundations for a short period of time.
We're having a little bit of internal discussion about whether we should now mandate for our office-based employees to go ahead and get the bivalent vaccine. And
Wow, that's interesting. Have fun.
Well, my view, and I don't know whether my medical team will agree with me, my view is simply that, number one, we're a healthcare company. Two is that people know what they should do. And three, we can't mandate intelligence. And, you know, it's out there, the science is out there, we're a healthcare company, so, you know, be fluent in there, and I'm happy to talk to any of them that's a doc. I send out intermittent emails that contain, you know, the most recent, what I think is the most important data about COVID vaccines, follow-up data, you know.
So can you put mine in the list, because I'm still on the fence.
Are you really? Okay. I took mine on Monday. I had my appointment on Monday.
It
So,
worked with Walensky.
yeah, well, you know, yeah, I know exactly. It didn't work for her. But who knows what she was doing. But I think this is a good conversation, right? This is exactly right. I mean, he's well read, right? He's fluent in all of this, and he's still asking that question. And so, in some ways, you know, like your approach, and I think you can mandate it, sure, but then you live the consequences, and it's not homogeneous at all. It is not homogeneous, and we have a culture where people are, you know, very deeply committed to their own ability to make their own decisions.
You know, Doug, you told the story during your speech about George Washington, right? And vaccinations.
No.
No,
Peter
no,
Marks.
I'm sorry, it was Peter Marks, but it was a smart story, so I just attributed it to you. So, but an interesting side story that is actually Benjamin Franklin had really believed in vaccination. And there was one way to vaccinate against type of particular disease. He delayed a couple of weeks to vaccinate his son, but then his son, he delayed, and then his son died of whatever the disease was because he didn't get vaccinated. So that's it. That's just Benjamin Franklin. By the way, I have a story. You were talking about intelligence and so forth. And I know this is off topic, but my wife and I were at a fundraiser, and they were auctioning off things, you know. So one was
Vaccine?
no, one was a picture of Albert Einstein with one of his famous quotes at the top. And we bid for it, and we lost to a dentist. I don't know why, we just didn't bid. But the quote was, "The difference between stupidity and genius is that there's a limit to genius."
Didn't Einstein also say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again?
Yeah.
Expecting different results.
Yeah.
Any other story? You guys are from ASI. What would you say would be the one or two things that have been the most disruptive in the last couple of years?
Most disruptive?
Yeah.
For the business. I'd say, I mean, most of the themes that you guys have hit on, in terms of clinical trials, in terms of, we were very eagerly digesting the IQVIA data because, you know, our CEO was very curious, and the executive team, you know, what's going on with patient visits, especially in oncology. And we understand that there's still, based on the data, there's still some lag in terms of patient visits and follow-ups and diagnoses. So, you know, I think, you know, all those things are affected, but, you know, as you saw in the, you know, big, not to be cynical at all, but in the big pharma equity prices, you know, I don't know if they call it big pharma, but wherever we are in the scope, medium pharma, you know, we sort of we're idiosyncratic based on our products. I mean, if you look at Alzheimer's, you know, that's what the street is sort of pricing at. So in terms of, you know, macro business, you know, disruption, that's kind of where we would stand. But of course, everyone has a very personal story in day to day, and how, you know, their life and their, you know, professional life is still trying to figure out. I mean, we're also figuring out how to get settled and work together. So, but yeah, most of the same things in terms of clinical trial, how to manage the field forces, sales reps. Dakota, how about for you?
You know, the only one that we've talked about a lot that comes up is, I think, supply is what everyone talks about, and I think that with our own products, we haven't had as much risk. But we've done a few transactions where we might be, the supply chain might get really interested. And you're trying to do a transaction, essentially sell a product that you have to, talk to your buyer and let them know, say, hey, you need to trust us that we can manage this. And with all the, COVID and everything we talked about, that can be a tough conversation to have, and a lot more risk than pre-pandemic. It was never much thought, and now that's a big thing.
So to give you a contrast to the life of a biotech company. Over the last 3 years, our CAGR for our launch, Uzira, has been 105%. My stock price in the last 14 months has dropped by 80%.
Yeah, totally logical. And
Totally illogical.
it's part of the fact, yeah, so this, we were giving, we were doing some advice on it, and the unbelievable thing was, your stock price was at a certain level, and then you had your first phase 3 that was done. I remember you got 3 of them done all at once, and the stock dropped. So, the one thing I will say, and this is true whether it's now or before or wherever, is that those people who feel that the markets, whether it's the stock trading markets or the M&A markets, are efficient, are damn fools. It is not. It is not efficient. It does not properly value companies. And so one of the things you have to do, and we do a huge amount of work to figure out what the inefficiencies in the market are and what's driving this and that. Because the reality is, for companies, whether they're just doing acquisitions or whether they're doing their public company, whatever. If you don't focus on understanding where the market's inefficient, either in your favor or against you, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, Jonathan and I are working on, there is a company, and I won't mention the name, but it is a pharma company. Most of it's a pharma, and then some of it, which is chemical, is trading at 1.2 times EBITDA. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. We understand why, but there's a case where it's a disaster, but it's real. It's a public, large public company. So, I would just say on the financial side, when you're thinking about, because at the end of the day, there's science and there's revenue and so forth, but at the end of the day, every company, public or private, has to focus on shareholder value, right? Because that you got owners, right? So all I'd say is think very carefully about shareholder value, so forth, and understand whether you're going to be unfairly or fairly treated, or can you shift yourself so that you're treated unfairly the other way, right? And part of what Evan's dealing with is the market doesn't like antibiotics. It makes no sense. There's a huge need for it, right? All the antibiotics are now the resistance is growing. It makes no sense at all, but it's just that is reality, and it may shift at some point, but you're not going to change the market. Right? So you can change your company in terms of what product you're in, but you can't change how the market.
Yeah, focus on what you can control. At the end of the day, I think it'll eventually work out. It's my view.
It usually does.
Yeah, it usually does. You continue to build value, build credibility, and you can't say stuff that ultimately you can't stand behind. That's your own personal credibility, and that always comes back. That always comes back. If you just play for the next quarter, or you just say something to make your investors happy, you're doing something. But at the end of the day, if you don't deliver against it, it's brutal. It's a very asymmetric market, right? You get a little bit of a bump for some positive news, or at least your stock doesn't go down. And if you deliver bad news, it's very asymmetric.
Any last question? Okay, I really want to thank this panel, and my expectations have been met in terms of the variety of things. It's a problem. Doug and I have known each other for a long time. You won't let me just say something and get away with it, right? So, but that's the privilege of a long-term relationship. But it's been wonderful, and I hope, first of all, with regard to this panel, that this has been useful to those of you here in person or virtual, and helps you think about your business in a different way. But also, since this is the last event, and shockingly, we are 4 minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. I hope that all of you really enjoyed this conference. We will be producing a summary, so it's going to be available on our website. But I hope that it's helped. All of these speeches have been helpful to you in thinking about your business in different ways. And I wish everyone success through these turbulent times. So thank you very much.